The streets of New York in the early 20th century were a chaotic, pulsating mix of opportunity, violence, and survival. Immigrants poured into the city in search of a better life, yet many found themselves trapped in overcrowded tenements, struggling to make ends meet while navigating a world that was indifferent, often hostile, to their existence. Among these neighborhoods, where poverty and crime intertwined with hope and ambition, young Charles "Lucky" Luciano emerged, a figure whose life would come to embody both the promise and the peril of the American dream. Born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in the small town of Lercara Fritti in Sicily, he was the son of a family steeped in tradition, honor, and a cautious respect for the old ways. His journey from these Sicilian roots to the apex of the criminal underworld in America was neither simple nor inevitable, yet it was shaped by forces both personal and historical, forces that would test his ingenuity, ruthlessness, and capacity for adaptation. From the moment he set foot in New York with his family, Luciano was thrust into an environment defined by struggle and hierarchy, where survival often required cunning and decisiveness. Immigrant communities in Manhattan's Lower East Side were densely packed, and while they offered a semblance of cultural familiarity, they were also arenas of intense competition. Jobs were scarce, resources limited, and the streets themselves became classrooms for lessons in risk, strategy, and human behavior. It was in this environment that young Luciano began to develop the instincts that would later define him as a leader, a keen sense of observation, the ability to anticipate danger, and an uncanny understanding of the motivations driving those around him. Even as a boy, he was aware of the delicate balance between fear and respect, opportunity and risk, a balance that would guide him for decades. The era into which Luciano came of age was one of transformation and tension. Prohibition had yet to sweep across the nation, but crime was already embedded in the social fabric. Gangs controlled territories, extorted businesses, and enforced codes of conduct through violence and intimidation. The Mafia, while present, was fragmented, its power concentrated in localized pockets where traditions often dictated behavior more than efficiency. In this environment, loyalty and family connections were paramount, yet survival required more than adherence to old codes, it demanded intelligence, strategic vision, and the willingness to make choices that others could not. Luciano's early exposure to this world honed his capacity for calculation and foresight. He watched, learned, and absorbed lessons from the successes and failures of those around him. The chaos of the streets became a laboratory for understanding power, hierarchy, and human nature. Luciano's adolescence was marked by petty crime, street fights, and early brushes with law enforcement. He was drawn to the streets not simply out of necessity, but from an instinctive attraction to influence, control, and the subtle dynamics of power. While other boys focused on survival alone, Luciano observed patterns, tested boundaries, and identified opportunities where others saw only danger. These formative experiences were crucial. They provided him with an intimate understanding of the mechanisms of fear and loyalty, the ways in which reputation could be both weapon and shield, and the means by which information and perception could be leveraged to achieve influence. It was a world in which knowledge, cunning, and psychological insight often outweighed brute strength, a world perfectly suited to Luciano's emerging talents. By his late teens, Luciano had begun forming alliances that would later underpin his rise. The criminal ecosystem of New York was competitive, and relationships were simultaneously fluid and fragile. Friendships could be formed in the moment of necessity, yet betrayals were always a possibility. Luciano's early partnerships reflected both his pragmatism and his emerging vision. He sought out individuals who were competent, ambitious, and reliable, regardless of their background. This approach would become a hallmark of his leadership style, emphasizing merit, utility, and trustworthiness over lineage or ethnicity. It was a stark departure from the insular practices of older generation gangsters, and it foreshadowed the inclusive, strategic alliances that would later define his empire. At the same time, Luciano's environment forced him to confront the consequences of power and violence at a young age. Witnessing rival gangs' conflicts, assassinations, and the arbitrary brutality that punctuated street life instilled in him both caution and respect for strategy. He recognized that survival, and dominance, required more than physical courage, it required anticipation, planning, and an understanding of human psychology. Every interaction, every negotiation, and every act of intimidation could ripple through the network of relationships, shaping loyalty, fear, and opportunity. Luciano's ability to read these dynamics, to interpret the unspoken motivations of others, became a defining feature of his leadership. He learned early that intelligence and perception could achieve what muscle alone could not, and that calculated restraint often carried greater reward than impulsive aggression. Education, in the conventional sense, was limited for Luciano, but the streets themselves became his university. He studied hierarchy, influence, and the management of risk with relentless attention. He observed how older gangsters negotiated territory, how disputes were resolved, or escalated, and how reputation could function as both armor and weapon. The lessons were often brutal. A misstep could result in injury, incarceration, or death. Yet these experiences forged a mind capable of both tactical calculation and long-term vision. Luciano began to conceptualize power not as mere accumulation of force, but as a complex interplay of relationships, influence, and leverage, a perspective that would later revolutionize organized crime in America. The social and cultural environment also shaped Luciano's understanding of opportunity. The immigrant neighborhoods he inhabited were full of ambition constrained by systemic inequities. While some individuals were limited by circumstance, others, like Luciano, saw the gaps in the system as openings for advancement. He recognized that those who could navigate both formal and informal networks, who could negotiate and manipulate social dynamics, could achieve dominance in ways that brute force alone could not. Luciano's genius was rooted in this ability to see beyond immediate survival, to anticipate future conditions, and to structure actions and alliances in ways that produced sustainable advantage. By the early 1920s, Luciano had begun to transition from street-level enforcer to organized strategist. His early criminal activities, petty theft, small-scale extortion, and local racketeering, provided both income and experience, but he understood that true power required organization. He observed the inefficiencies and infighting among older gangs and realized that a disciplined, coordinated approach could vastly increase profits and influence. This insight was the germination of his later vision, a mafia structured not on personal vendettas or arbitrary authority, but on systematic governance, strategic alliances, and operational oversight. It was a vision that combined intellect, psychology, and practicality in a way that no other contemporary gangster had attempted. Luciano's formative years also instilled in him a profound understanding of perception and reputation. In a world where rumors could destroy lives and respect could command obedience, he learned to cultivate an aura of control, composure, and untouchability. Every action, from small gestures to bold initiatives, was calibrated to reinforce his image and to manipulate the expectations of both allies and adversaries. He recognized that psychological influence could extend far beyond immediate physical presence, that the threat of retaliation, the promise of reward, and the display of strategic brilliance could command loyalty and compliance at a distance. This mastery of perception became as essential to his rise as any financial or organizational innovation. By the time Luciano reached adulthood, he was already demonstrating the combination of intelligence, ambition, and ruthlessness that would define his career. He was disciplined in his planning, strategic in his alliances, and unflinching in his enforcement of authority when necessary. Yet he balanced this ruthlessness with pragmatism, understanding that indiscriminate violence could destabilize his network, alienate allies, and attract unwanted attention from authorities. His emerging philosophy was clear: power was most effectively exercised through structure, calculation, and influence rather than through chaos and unrestrained aggression. This mindset laid the foundation for his later innovations, transforming not just his personal trajectory but the nature of organized crime in America. Ultimately, the introduction of Luciano's story is not merely about the man himself, but about the world that shaped him and the instincts he developed in response. It is a portrait of a society defined by struggle, hierarchy, and opportunity, a landscape in which the strongest, smartest, and most adaptable could rise above circumstance. It is also a meditation on the interplay of intelligence, psychology, and ambition in the creation of power. Luciano's formative years reveal the emergence of a mind capable of perceiving patterns where others saw only chaos, of calculating risks where others acted impulsively, and of orchestrating influence where others relied solely on force. The streets of New York, with all their danger, complexity, and opportunity, became the proving ground for a man who would ultimately reshape the underworld forever. From the crowded tenements of Manhattan to the shadowed alleys where deals and betrayals occurred, Luciano's early life offers a lens into both the personal and structural forces that drive power. His story begins here, in this intersection of ambition, intelligence, and circumstance, a story that would unfold across decades of violence, strategy, and unparalleled transformation of the criminal underworld. The world he inherited was one of chaos, but through cunning, foresight, and sheer force of intellect, Luciano would turn it into an empire. The seeds of genius, ambition, and ruthless pragmatism planted in these early years would grow to define not just his life, but the very framework of modern organized crime. Before Lucky Luciano emerged as the architect of a new era of organized crime, the underworld of New York was a fractured, chaotic landscape dominated by tradition, brutality, and personal vendettas. The Italian-American Mafia existed in pockets across the city, controlled by local bosses who wielded authority through fear, family ties, and the occasional display of ruthless violence. Power was fragmented, and the absence of a unifying system created constant conflict. Rivalries erupted over territory, profits, and personal honor, often leading to cycles of murder and reprisal that destabilized communities and intimidated both allies and innocents alike. In this world, survival and influence were as much about navigating complex social dynamics as they were about brute force. The early 20th century underworld operated on a system that valued tradition over efficiency. Leadership was often inherited or established through displays of personal courage rather than strategic insight. While some bosses had the capacity for organization, many relied on intimidation and fear to maintain control, resulting in a volatile and unpredictable criminal environment. For young ambitious figures like Luciano, this presented both a challenge and an opportunity. He observed that violence alone could not create sustainable dominance. What was required was vision, structure, and the ability to manipulate both allies and enemies. This understanding would later define his approach to crime, transforming it from chaotic turf wars into a disciplined, profit-driven enterprise. The chaos of the underworld was magnified by the rise of prohibition in 1920. The outlawing of alcohol created a new, highly lucrative opportunity for organized crime, drawing in ambitious figures who sought to capitalize on the nation's thirst for liquor. Speakeasies, bootlegging networks, and smuggling operations proliferated, but the absence of coordination led to frequent clashes. Gangs competed for control over neighborhoods, distribution routes, and supply chains, often resorting to violence to assert dominance. For the traditional mafia, prohibition was both a boon and a stress test. The profits were enormous, but so were the stakes. Failure to protect territory or eliminate rivals could result in financial ruin, or death. This environment highlighted the weaknesses of the old guard, who were often unwilling or unable to adapt to the rapidly changing criminal economy. Territorial disputes were a constant feature of life in the underworld. Italian-American gangs, many led by older Sicilian immigrants, jealously guarded their neighborhoods and illicit businesses. New arrivals and ambitious younger criminals were often seen as threats, and alliances were tenuous, contingent upon shared interests rather than genuine loyalty. Blood feuds were common, and retribution was swift. In this fractured ecosystem, trust was scarce, and betrayal could come from the most unexpected quarters. Young Luciano witnessed firsthand how inefficiency, personal ego, and failure to innovate left traditional gangs vulnerable, creating openings for new leaders who could think strategically and act decisively. The psychological climate of the pre-Luciano Mafia was one of constant vigilance and tension. Fear was a dominant currency, with leaders relying heavily on intimidation to enforce compliance. Yet while fear commanded obedience, it also generated instability. Violence prompted retaliation, and personal vendettas often escalated conflicts beyond anyone's control. The lack of systematic management meant that profits were frequently undermined by unnecessary conflict, and alliances were fragile at best. Luciano recognized that a system based solely on intimidation was unsustainable. He observed that human behavior was nuanced, loyalty could be earned, fear could be leveraged, and ambition could be channeled, but only if combined with structure, incentives, and strategic oversight. In addition to internal instability, external pressures compounded the volatility of the underworld. Law enforcement, though often corrupt or inconsistent, presented a constant threat. Police raids, arrests, and prosecutions disrupted operations and destabilized leadership hierarchies. Political figures occasionally intervened, exploiting corruption or public outrage to consolidate control. The media, hungry for sensational stories, amplified both fear and public scrutiny, further complicating the environment. This combination of internal chaos and external pressure created a landscape in which power was precarious, alliances were fragile, and survival demanded both cunning and adaptability. The older generation of Mafia leaders relied heavily on traditional notions of honor, family, and Sicilian codes of conduct. Decisions were often guided by personal relationships and cultural norms rather than efficiency or profitability. Marriages, bloodlines, and historical loyalty determined much of the structure, leaving little room for innovation or pragmatism. In this system, leaders who failed to anticipate threats or modernize operations were at constant risk of being supplanted by more adaptable rivals. Luciano observed these dynamics closely, noting how rigidity and adherence to outdated norms limited potential growth and exposed weaknesses that could be exploited strategically. Economic pressures and social conditions also shaped the underworld's landscape. Immigrant communities were crowded, impoverished, and often marginalized, leaving many young men with limited opportunities outside crime. Gangs filled a void, providing protection, economic access, and a sense of identity. Yet these opportunities were localized and uncoordinated, meaning that success was often temporary and fraught with risk. Luciano saw that influence and wealth could be expanded far beyond individual neighborhoods if a more organized, systematized approach were applied. He began to conceptualize an enterprise that transcended the limitations of fragmented street gangs, one that could operate efficiently across ethnic, territorial, and operational lines. The pre-Luciano underworld also lacked mechanisms for dispute resolution. Conflicts were resolved through violence, intimidation, or ad hoc negotiation, creating instability that undermined long-term planning. Leaders often operated in isolation, unaware of the broader network of crime and opportunity that existed outside their immediate sphere. Luciano recognized that coordination, communication, and a centralized framework could mitigate these issues. By creating a system in which disputes could be managed through agreed-upon protocols rather than constant bloodshed, he envisioned a mafia that was both more stable and more profitable. Crucially, Luciano understood the psychological limitations of fear-based leadership. While violence could enforce compliance, it could not inspire loyalty or initiative. The old guard depended on obedience, but this created stagnation and vulnerability. Leaders who ruled solely through intimidation were constantly testing loyalty, and the cost of miscalculation was high. Luciano's early observations in this environment led him to value a combination of respect, incentives, and calculated consequences, a more sophisticated form of governance that leveraged human psychology to maintain stability and maximize productivity. The failure of the traditional system became increasingly apparent as Prohibition-era profits soared. Rival gangs clashed violently over alcohol distribution, while corruption and inefficiency eroded potential revenue. Some leaders relied on personal reputation and past exploits, failing to adapt to the scale and complexity of modern criminal operations. Luciano saw the opportunity to reorganize, to consolidate, and to impose a rational structure on what had previously been a chaotic, reactive network. His vision was not merely to survive the environment, but to master it, transforming a fragmented criminal landscape into a cohesive, disciplined, and highly profitable enterprise. This period also highlighted the significance of cross-ethnic alliances. While the traditional mafia was insular, controlling power within Italian-American circles, there were other ethnic criminal organizations, Jewish, Irish, and others, operating independently yet intersecting in terms of territory, labor, and illicit trade. The potential for collaboration was largely untapped, limited by prejudice, tradition, and mistrust. Luciano recognized that bridging these divides could yield extraordinary strategic and financial advantages. By forming alliances with capable individuals regardless of ethnicity, he could consolidate power, reduce conflict, and expand influence across a broader operational landscape. This forward-thinking approach set the stage for the revolutionary changes he would later implement in the underworld. Ultimately, the world before Lucky Luciano was a proving ground of chaos, opportunity, and danger. It was a place where power was fragmented, violence was omnipresent, and ambition could only be realized through cunning, strategy, and ruthlessness. For Luciano, these conditions were not obstacles, they were opportunities to observe, learn, and refine the instincts that would later define his leadership. He saw firsthand the consequences of mismanagement, the fragility of alliances, and the limitations of fear-based control. Most importantly, he recognized the potential for transformation, that the underworld, if guided by intelligence, organization, and psychological insight, could evolve from a disordered network of gangs into a coordinated, efficient, and extraordinarily profitable enterprise. This understanding of the pre-Luciano underworld is essential to comprehending the magnitude of his later achievements. He did not invent organized crime, but he reinvented it, imposing structure, strategic vision, and psychological sophistication on a landscape defined by unpredictability and chaos. The contrast between the disordered, violent environment of the early Mafia and the disciplined, corporate-like empire he would later construct illustrates the revolutionary nature of his leadership. It also underscores the human and environmental factors that shaped his vision, the interplay of fear, loyalty, ambition, and opportunity, observed and harnessed by a man whose intelligence and ruthlessness would change the course of criminal history. In sum, the underworld that Luciano inherited was a fragmented world of violence, inefficiency, and fragile alliances, a world where survival depended on instinct, courage, and the occasional stroke of luck. Yet it was precisely this environment that allowed Luciano to cultivate the skills, observations, and strategic foresight that would later enable him to rise above the chaos and impose a new order. Understanding this pre-Luciano world illuminates not only the challenges he faced but also the extraordinary nature of his vision, revealing how a combination of intelligence, ambition, and psychological insight could transform disorder into empire, violence into structure, and chaos into opportunity. The stage was set, and the conditions were ripe for a man who could see beyond the limitations of the old ways, a man who would become the undisputed architect of modern organized crime. Charles Lucky Luciano's rise from street kid to criminal mastermind was not predestined, but it was forged in the crucible of New York's Lower East Side, where poverty, violence, and opportunity collided. Born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897, he arrived in America as a young boy, carrying with him the heritage, discipline, and ambition that would later define his life. The immigrant neighborhoods of Manhattan were crowded and dangerous, filled with families like his own who struggled to survive while navigating a society that was indifferent at best, hostile at worst. It was here, in the maze of tenements, narrow alleys, and bustling streets, that Luciano first encountered the forces that would shape his destiny: crime, power, and human ambition. From an early age, Luciano displayed a combination of curiosity, intelligence, and audacity. He quickly learned that influence in the streets was not determined by physical strength alone but by perception, timing, and strategic thinking. Observing older gangsters, he noted the delicate balance between fear, respect, and loyalty. While some young men relied purely on intimidation or impulsive aggression, Luciano began to develop a more sophisticated approach, understanding that control could be exercised through psychological insight as much as through force. Even in adolescence, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate the actions of others, manipulate situations to his advantage, and recognize opportunity where others saw risk. Luciano's early ventures into crime were typical of the Lower East Side environment, yet even in these formative activities, his potential became evident. He engaged in petty theft, small-scale extortion, and street-level rackets, using these experiences not merely to earn money, but to understand the dynamics of power and influence. Each encounter, each negotiation, each confrontation served as both education and test. He learned to read people, to gauge loyalties, and to anticipate betrayals. The streets were ruthless, and mistakes were costly, but Luciano's capacity for observation, calculation, and rapid adaptation allowed him not only to survive but to thrive. The landscape of New York's criminal world during this period was fragmented, with numerous gangs competing for control of neighborhoods, resources, and illicit markets. Older, established mafia figures often ruled through fear and personal reputation, while violence was the primary method of conflict resolution. Luciano, however, recognized the limitations of this model. Reliance on intimidation alone created instability, invited retaliation, and restricted long-term profitability. From his earliest interactions, he developed a vision that would later become the blueprint for modern organized crime: power structured through systems, alliances, and strategic management rather than chaos and impulsive aggression. Education in the conventional sense was minimal, but Luciano's learning came from the school of experience. He absorbed lessons about human behavior, loyalty, and leadership from the men around him. He noted that respect could be more effective than fear, that alliances were more valuable than enmities, and that influence depended not only on control but also on perception. The principles he internalized during these years would guide his approach to criminal enterprise for decades: assess risks carefully, reward loyalty, punish betrayal strategically, and always maintain the perception of control and authority. Luciano was learning to think not just as a participant in the streets, but as a strategist capable of orchestrating complex operations and relationships. By his late teens, Luciano had begun forming critical alliances that would underpin his rise. He connected with other ambitious young criminals who, like him, recognized the inefficiencies and vulnerabilities of the existing power structures. These relationships were pragmatic rather than sentimental, forged through mutual benefit and shared ambition rather than tradition or family ties. Luciano demonstrated an early understanding of meritocracy within the criminal world. He valued competence, reliability, and strategic alignment over ancestry or past reputation. This approach contrasted sharply with the older generation of mobsters, whose authority often rested on age, family connections, or adherence to outdated codes of honor. At the same time, Luciano's environment demanded constant awareness and adaptability. Gang wars, territorial disputes, and the threat of law enforcement created a world in which miscalculations could be fatal. He learned to navigate these dangers with a combination of caution and boldness, understanding when to assert power directly and when to maneuver through indirect influence. This balance of risk and prudence became a hallmark of his leadership style. Luciano's capacity to maintain composure under pressure, to anticipate the moves of rivals, and to manipulate both allies and enemies distinguished him from peers who relied solely on instinct or brute force. The introduction of prohibition in 1920 dramatically altered the criminal landscape, providing enormous opportunities for those willing and able to exploit them. Luciano saw the potential to elevate himself beyond the limitations of petty crime. Speakeasies, bootlegging operations, and the burgeoning black market for alcohol created avenues for wealth, influence, and expansion. Yet these opportunities also amplified competition and risk. Rival gangs fought violently for control over distribution networks, and the stakes were higher than ever. Luciano recognized that success in this new environment required not just courage, but a disciplined, strategic approach to organization, alliances, and operational oversight. Luciano's early experiences also honed his skills in negotiation and psychological manipulation. He understood that the perception of power could be as impactful as actual power. By cultivating a reputation for intelligence, decisiveness, and ruthlessness when necessary, he influenced the behavior of both friends and rivals. Loyalty could be earned and maintained through a combination of respect, reward, and carefully calibrated intimidation, while fear could be leveraged to prevent insubordination without inviting unnecessary retaliation. These psychological insights allowed him to consolidate influence in ways that older, more traditional gangsters had not anticipated. As he transitioned from adolescence into young adulthood, Luciano began to conceptualize a broader vision for power. He saw the inefficiencies of fragmented gangs and the potential for a coordinated, disciplined criminal enterprise. He recognized that disputes could be managed strategically rather than through continuous violence, that alliances could extend across ethnic and territorial boundaries, and that reputation and perception could be wielded as tools of governance. Even at this early stage, Luciano's mind was attuned to systems, networks, and the long-term consequences of action, a perspective that set him apart from contemporaries who were focused on immediate gain or personal vendettas. The environment of Luciano's rise was also defined by the human cost of crime. Violence, exploitation, and coercion were endemic, and the consequences of mismanagement could be devastating. Luciano observed the fragility of loyalty, the volatility of human behavior, and the risks inherent in overreach. These lessons informed his approach to leadership. Power could not simply be seized, it had to be cultivated, managed, and maintained. Control required foresight, strategy, and an understanding of both individual and collective motivations. By internalizing these lessons early, Luciano laid the foundation for an empire that would later balance fear, loyalty, and profitability with unprecedented sophistication. Crucially, Luciano's rise was also facilitated by his ability to anticipate the evolution of the criminal landscape. He understood that Prohibition-era opportunities were only the beginning, that success required adaptability, foresight, and innovation. While older mobsters clung to tradition, Luciano sought to redefine the rules of the game. He envisioned a system in which crime could be organized, disputes could be resolved without constant bloodshed, and alliances could be leveraged for mutual benefit. This visionary approach distinguished him from contemporaries and positioned him to dominate the underworld in the decades to come. By the early 1920s, Luciano had transitioned from street-level enforcer to emerging strategist. He had begun building networks, establishing authority, and demonstrating an ability to integrate intelligence, psychology, and organizational skill into his approach. This period of his life illustrates the interplay of circumstance, observation, and innate ability. The harsh streets provided lessons, the chaos offered opportunities, and Luciano's mind synthesized these experiences into a framework for dominance. It was in this crucible that the foundation for his later empire, structured, disciplined, and far-reaching, was forged. Ultimately, the rise of Lucky Luciano is not merely a story of personal ambition, it is a study in adaptability, intelligence, and the orchestration of human behavior under conditions of extreme risk and uncertainty. His journey from a Lower East Side street kid to a figure capable of reshaping organized crime reflects a combination of acute observation, psychological insight, strategic calculation, and ruthless pragmatism. Luciano learned to navigate the forces of poverty, violence, and fragmented power not by brute strength alone, but by mastering the art of influence, reputation, and organization. He began to see the underworld not as a collection of isolated conflicts but as a system that could be understood, controlled, and optimized. This stage of his life, the formative years of his criminal ascent, sets the stage for the transformative impact he would later have on the Mafia. By combining the lessons of street survival with vision, strategy, and psychological mastery, Luciano prepared himself to challenge the old guard, consolidate power, and ultimately redefine organized crime in America. The rise of a street kid into the architect of modern criminal enterprise is a story of intellect, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of influence, a story in which the chaos of New York City itself becomes both teacher and proving ground. The transition from ambitious street kid to the builder of an empire required more than courage or ambition, it required vision, strategy, and a profound understanding of human behavior. By the early 1920s, Lucky Luciano had not only established himself as a formidable figure within the chaotic streets of New York, but he had also begun to conceptualize what a truly organized criminal enterprise could look like. The city was still a fragmented battlefield of gangs, each vying for territory, influence, and profits, yet within this chaos lay enormous opportunity for a mind capable of seeing beyond immediate struggles and rivalries. Luciano's early observations of inefficiency, disunity, and short-sightedness among the old guard would become the foundation for his revolutionary approach to organized crime. Luciano recognized that to consolidate power and achieve lasting influence, he would need to build an organization that mirrored the principles of legitimate business, albeit one operating outside the law. This meant creating systems, establishing protocols, and ensuring loyalty, not through fear alone, but through incentives, reputation, and strategic alliances. The old Mafia model was unsustainable. It relied too heavily on individual prowess, violent enforcement, and family-based hierarchy. By contrast, Luciano envisioned a structure in which authority was centralized, operations were coordinated, and rivalries could be mitigated through negotiation rather than constant bloodshed. He understood that control over information, communication, and logistics would be just as crucial as the capacity for violence. To realize this vision, Luciano began forging critical alliances. Unlike the insular approach of his predecessors, he valued skill, reliability, and strategic compatibility over lineage or ethnicity. He cultivated relationships with both Italian-American and Jewish gangsters, bridging traditional divides to create partnerships that were mutually advantageous. These alliances allowed him to expand influence across New York, gain access to lucrative operations, and consolidate power in a way that older bosses, constrained by tradition and personal animosities, could not. Luciano's ability to recognize talent, negotiate loyalty, and strategically deploy his associates was unprecedented and became a defining feature of his leadership. Luciano's methods were meticulous and disciplined. He did not rely on chaos or intimidation alone. He built a network of trusted lieutenants, each with defined responsibilities and authority. This allowed him to oversee operations indirectly while maintaining centralized control. By delegating effectively and establishing clear hierarchies, Luciano ensured that his empire could function even when he was not physically present. He created a culture in which competence was rewarded, loyalty was expected, and betrayal was met with swift, calculated consequences. The combination of strategic oversight, psychological insight, and operational delegation set him apart from contemporaries who managed their power through brute force or fear alone. The infrastructure of Luciano's emerging empire extended into multiple illicit enterprises, including gambling, bootlegging, extortion, and labor racketeering. Each operation was approached with a level of organization and planning that had previously been absent from the underworld. Territories were mapped, supply chains coordinated, and disputes resolved through negotiation or arbitration within his inner circle rather than through uncontrolled violence. Luciano understood that efficiency and profitability depended on both reducing unnecessary conflict and maintaining the perception of strength. By creating a framework that balanced control with flexibility, he ensured that his empire could adapt to challenges, expand into new markets, and survive both internal and external pressures. Central to Luciano's success was his understanding of human psychology. He recognized that fear alone was insufficient to maintain loyalty and influence. Respect, opportunity, and reputation were equally powerful tools. By rewarding loyalty, providing avenues for advancement, and cultivating an aura of intelligence and decisiveness, he secured the commitment of his subordinates. Conversely, those who betrayed him or threatened his operations faced consequences that were both precise and symbolic, reinforcing the boundaries of power without destabilizing the overall system. Luciano's ability to calibrate fear, reward, and perception demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication unmatched by his peers. The creation of the Commission, though later formalized, had its roots in this period of strategic organization. Luciano understood that conflict among Mafia factions weakened overall influence and profitability. By instituting a system for mediation, dispute resolution, and collective decision-making, he began to lay the groundwork for a unified governing body that would oversee operations, allocate territory, and maintain order among rival families. This vision was revolutionary. It shifted the Mafia from a series of feuding gangs into a coordinated network capable of strategic planning, long-term growth, and crisis management. Luciano's insight into the benefits of collective governance, combined with his ability to assert influence over multiple factions, marked a turning point in the evolution of organized crime. Luciano also excelled at managing risk and navigating law enforcement pressures. He understood that visibility and overexposure could threaten both his personal safety and the stability of his organization. To mitigate this, he maintained a low personal profile while delegating operational tasks to trusted associates. He cultivated relationships with corrupt officials, politicians, and law enforcement figures, using bribery, influence, and strategic negotiation to protect his interests. This balance of discretion, strategic risk-taking, and manipulation of external forces further distinguished his approach from the reactive and often reckless tactics of older gang leaders. Another critical aspect of Luciano's empire building was his approach to cross-ethnic collaboration. Historically, Italian-American gangsters had operated in isolation, while Jewish, Irish, and other criminal groups controlled separate territories and trades. Luciano recognized that these divisions were artificial barriers to efficiency and profit. By forging pragmatic alliances with leaders across these groups, he not only reduced conflict but also created mutually beneficial networks that expanded the scope and reach of operations. These partnerships exemplified his strategic pragmatism. Loyalty and capability were valued over heritage, and opportunities for mutual gain were pursued with careful planning and negotiation. Luciano's organizational philosophy extended beyond immediate profits. He sought to create a system resilient enough to endure beyond his personal control. He implemented procedures for succession, established lines of communication, and cultivated trusted lieutenants who could manage operations independently if necessary. This foresight demonstrated his understanding of the importance of continuity, reputation, and institutional memory in maintaining long-term influence. Luciano was building not just an empire, but a legacy, a framework that could survive internal strife, law enforcement pressure, and the inevitable challenges of time. The rise of Lucky Luciano also highlighted his extraordinary capacity for strategic patience. He did not attempt to dominate through reckless aggression or impulsive action. Rather, he waited for opportune moments, assessed risks, and acted decisively when conditions were most favorable. This measured approach allowed him to outmaneuver rivals, consolidate power, and implement reforms without provoking destabilizing conflicts. His combination of patience, foresight, and calculated risk-taking became a hallmark of his leadership style and a key factor in the success of his enterprise. In addition to his structural innovations, Luciano's personal charisma and intelligence played a vital role in empire building. He was able to inspire loyalty, negotiate complex alliances, and command respect across diverse groups. His presence exuded authority, and his reputation for intelligence and decisiveness amplified his influence. Subordinates and allies understood that while he was capable of ruthless action, he was also capable of strategic vision, fairness in arbitration, and rewarding loyalty. This combination of fear, respect, and opportunity created a culture in which power was exercised efficiently and effectively. By the mid-1920s, Luciano had successfully transitioned from a street-level figure into a master organizer whose influence extended across multiple criminal sectors. His vision of a disciplined, structured, and psychologically sophisticated organization had taken shape, laying the foundation for a revolutionary transformation of the Mafia. The chaos of the past was giving way to coordination, foresight, and strategic governance. Rival factions recognized his authority, not merely because of his personal capacity for violence, but because of the efficiency, profitability, and stability that his methods produced. Luciano had not only seized control, he had redefined what control could mean in the underworld. The process of building the empire was not without challenges. Rival bosses, entrenched traditions, and the unpredictable pressures of law enforcement all tested his strategy and resolve. Yet Luciano's adaptability, intelligence, and capacity to manage human behavior allowed him to navigate these obstacles with remarkable success. He approached threats strategically, identifying both vulnerabilities and opportunities, and leveraged alliances to consolidate power rather than escalate conflict unnecessarily. This sophisticated balancing act, between aggression and diplomacy, fear and respect, immediate gain and long-term stability, was central to his success and a hallmark of his leadership philosophy. Ultimately, the period of empire building represents the transformation of Luciano from an ambitious street kid into a visionary architect of organized crime. He moved beyond reactive survival to proactive orchestration, creating a system in which power, influence, and profitability were managed with the precision of a modern corporation. His innovations, centralized authority, structured delegation, cross-ethnic alliances, psychological mastery, and strategic foresight, revolutionized the underworld, establishing patterns that would endure for decades. Luciano's genius lay not merely in his capacity for violence, but in his ability to conceptualize, implement, and maintain complex systems of influence under conditions of constant risk and uncertainty. The story of building the empire is, at its core, a study of vision, strategy, and human psychology. It illustrates how intelligence, observation, and calculated action can transform chaos into order, instability into opportunity, and ambition into enduring power. Luciano's ability to synthesize lessons from his early experiences, apply them with foresight, and execute with precision set the stage for his dominance of the Mafia and the lasting impact of his organizational innovations. This period of his life underscores the extraordinary interplay between intellect, ruthlessness, and strategy that defined him, not just as a gangster, but as a transformational leader whose influence would shape organized crime for generations. Luciano's ascent from street-level hustler to the architect of a new mafia marked a turning point not only in his life but in the history of organized crime in America. By the mid-1920s, he had gained enough influence and insight to recognize the fundamental flaws of the traditional mafia structure, its reliance on arbitrary violence, fragmented loyalties, and outdated codes that prioritized personal honor over efficiency and profit. Where previous generations had treated criminal enterprises as isolated fiefdoms, Luciano envisioned a coordinated, corporate-style organization, one that operated on principles of order, accountability, and mutual benefit. This vision would eventually culminate in the creation of the Commission, a governing body designed to mediate disputes, allocate territory, and standardize operations among the various families of New York and beyond. In doing so, he transformed crime from a chaotic struggle for survival into a strategic enterprise, a business model that prioritized sustainability over impulsive aggression. The establishment of this new mafia required both innovation and pragmatism. Luciano understood that alliances were essential, not only within the Italian-American community but also with Jewish and Irish gangsters who controlled significant parts of the city's illicit economy. He forged close ties with figures such as Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, recognizing that cooperation across ethnic lines could maximize profits and reduce the frequency of destructive turf wars. These partnerships were unprecedented at the time, challenging traditional notions of loyalty and prejudice in the underworld. Luciano's approach was pragmatic. He valued skill, strategy, and reliability over heritage, believing that a network of competent allies could achieve far more than fragmented, self-interested factions. The psychological sophistication of Luciano's methods was as revolutionary as the structural changes he implemented. He cultivated an image of calm authority, even in the midst of chaos, which inspired confidence in allies and fear in rivals. He used diplomacy and negotiation as effectively as intimidation, understanding that respect and loyalty could be leveraged to maintain order without constant bloodshed. Through careful observation and manipulation, he was able to anticipate potential conflicts before they escalated, employing both subtle influence and decisive action to keep rivals in check. This combination of strategic vision and psychological acumen allowed him to consolidate power while minimizing unnecessary risk, a stark contrast to the violent, impulsive tactics of the previous generation. Luciano also innovated the operational side of organized crime, treating illegal enterprises with the same analytical rigor as legitimate businesses. He standardized methods for running gambling operations, controlling unions, and distributing bootlegged alcohol, instituting rules that ensured consistency, reliability, and profitability. By creating a framework that could function independently of any one individual, he reduced vulnerability and ensured continuity, even in the face of arrests, betrayals, or other disruptions. This structural foresight was key to the enduring success of his organization, establishing patterns of governance, communication, and accountability that would define organized crime for decades. The creation of the Commission was perhaps Luciano's most significant achievement. Modeled on a corporate board, it provided a forum for resolving disputes between families, allocating territories, and setting policies to prevent unnecessary conflict. It formalized a code of conduct that balanced profit and discipline, blending old-world mafia traditions with modern organizational principles. By doing so, Luciano shifted the paradigm from violent rivalry to controlled negotiation, where compromise and strategic cooperation became tools of power. The commission not only reduced bloodshed but also enhanced efficiency, enabling the Mafia to operate on a scale previously unimaginable. Luciano's ability to merge the old with the new, combining Sicilian Mafia traditions with modern business strategy, was key to his dominance. He respected the cultural and symbolic elements of loyalty and honor but reframed them to serve practical objectives rather than abstract ideals. This balance between tradition and innovation, respect and pragmatism, allowed him to command loyalty while simultaneously expanding influence. His genius lay not merely in the accumulation of power but in his capacity to structure that power in ways that were sustainable, adaptable, and far-reaching. By the late 1920s, Luciano had positioned himself not just as a powerful figure within the Mafia, but as a visionary strategist who fundamentally reshaped organized crime in America. He had moved beyond the role of street enforcer or gang lieutenant to become a thinker, an innovator, and an architect of an enduring criminal empire. This period marked the crystallization of his unique approach, the blending of intelligence, psychology, and structural planning to create an organization that could survive and thrive amid the turbulence of New York's criminal underworld. Luciano was no longer merely a participant in the underworld, he had become its engineer, the man capable of turning chaos into order and ambition into empire. Luciano's rise was not achieved in isolation. Along the way, he relied on a network of mentors, allies, and even temporary partnerships, each of whom played a crucial role in shaping his understanding of power, loyalty, and betrayal. Early on, figures like Arnold Rothstein, a man known for his business-like approach to crime, taught him the value of strategic thinking and financial acumen. Rothstein's ability to manipulate markets, settle disputes with subtlety, and command respect without brute force left a lasting impression on the young Luciano. He learned that influence could be wielded quietly, that reputation often outweighed physical dominance, and that a well-placed alliance could achieve what violence alone could not. These lessons became the foundation of his own approach to building a criminal empire. Meyer Lansky emerged as perhaps Luciano's closest confidant and strategic partner. Their collaboration represented a shift from ethnic insularity to a more inclusive, results-oriented criminal network. Together, they recognized that cooperation across different immigrant groups, Italian, Jewish, and even Irish, could maximize profits while reducing destructive conflict. Lansky's financial expertise complemented Luciano's organizational and psychological skills, creating a synergy that allowed them to consolidate power in ways that no single group could achieve alone. Their alliance exemplified Luciano's pragmatic approach. Personal loyalty was valuable, but competence and reliability were paramount. Yet alliances came with risks. Luciano quickly learned that trust was fragile in the criminal world and that betrayal could strike from any quarter. Figures he had once considered allies occasionally turned into rivals, and even family ties could be compromised by ambition or fear. The ability to navigate these shifting loyalties became a central skill. Luciano developed a keen psychological intuition, able to sense disloyalty before it manifested, anticipate rival moves, and manipulate situations to his advantage. He balanced charm and intimidation, offering protection and rewards to secure loyalty while demonstrating, when necessary, the consequences of betrayal. This dynamic interplay of trust and fear became one of his most effective tools, allowing him to maintain control even in a world defined by treachery. Mentorship and strategic observation were also critical. Luciano watched older mobsters closely, learning from both their successes and their failures. He noted that many were overly reliant on violence to solve disputes, often escalating conflicts unnecessarily and destabilizing their own operations. By contrast, Luciano adopted a calculated approach. He used violence selectively, only when it served a clear strategic purpose, and often relied on negotiation, bribery, or subtle pressure to achieve his goals. This blend of pragmatism and ruthlessness distinguished him from his peers, allowing him to rise above the limitations of traditional mafia thinking. Personal relationships also influenced his early decisions. Allies who understood his vision became partners in both crime and strategy, while those who resisted were neutralized or removed. This careful cultivation of relationships extended to his emerging network of enforcers, accountants, and intermediaries, all of whom played specialized roles in the operation of his growing empire. Luciano understood that the strength of an organization lay in its structure, its delegation of responsibility, and the loyalty of its members. By surrounding himself with competent and reliable individuals, he created a system that could function effectively even in his absence, a principle that would underpin the corporate-style mafia he was developing. The interplay of loyalty, mentorship, and betrayal also had psychological implications. Luciano's ability to manipulate perception, appearing approachable to allies, intimidating to rivals, and untouchable to the public, reinforced his authority. He understood that reputation was a form of currency, sometimes more powerful than money or muscle. By maintaining a delicate balance between trust and fear, he ensured that even those who disagreed with him remained cautious, respectful, and often cooperative. This sophisticated use of psychology, combined with strategic alliances, allowed him to consolidate power efficiently and sustainably. By the time he fully stepped into the leadership of his emerging empire, Luciano's network of allies, mentors, and cautiously managed relationships provided both the support and the intelligence necessary to expand his influence. His early experiences with guidance, collaboration, and betrayal had honed his strategic mind and reinforced his belief that success depended as much on people as on action. Luciano's ability to navigate this complex web of relationships, balancing loyalty and pragmatism, laid the groundwork for his revolutionary reorganization of the Mafia, setting the stage for the unprecedented expansion and control he would soon achieve. Luciano's genius lay not only in strategy and psychological insight but in his ability to turn criminal enterprises into highly organized and profitable operations. He recognized early that crime could be approached like a legitimate business, with investments, returns, and systems of management. Gambling, bootlegging, unions, and prostitution were not merely sources of immediate income, they were assets to be developed, controlled, and optimized. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who relied on brute force or ad hoc schemes, Luciano sought to institutionalize these operations, introducing accountability, hierarchies, and operational consistency. This approach maximized profits while minimizing risk, transforming chaotic street-level crime into a sustainable empire that could endure scrutiny, competition, and legal pressure. Gambling was among Luciano's first major focuses. Speakeasies, betting parlors, and illegal lotteries offered immense profits, but they required careful oversight to avoid theft, infiltration, or violent disruption. Luciano implemented systems for management, delegating authority to trusted lieutenants while retaining ultimate control. His approach emphasized efficiency, security, and adaptability. By standardizing rules, controlling access, and monitoring operations meticulously, he reduced losses and increased reliability. The innovation lay not only in profit generation but in operational control, a level of sophistication previously unseen in the underworld. Bootlegging, however, represented the real financial revolution for Luciano. With prohibition in effect, the demand for alcohol created a multi-billion-dollar black market. Luciano capitalized on this opportunity by coordinating supply chains, distribution networks, and protection arrangements. He partnered with other ethnic criminal groups, ensuring smooth collaboration and minimizing conflict over territory and resources. Luciano applied his organizational principles to every stage of the operation: sourcing, transport, distribution, and retail. His oversight extended to bribing officials, protecting shipments, and managing disputes, effectively treating illegal trade with the precision and attention of a Fortune 500 executive. Union manipulation provided another avenue for control and profit. Luciano understood that labor unions wielded power beyond simple economics. They could influence political decisions, disrupt competitors, and enforce compliance. By infiltrating and controlling unions, he not only secured financial gains through extortion and embezzlement but also strengthened his broader influence in the city. Union control allowed him to manipulate markets, protect operations, and punish rivals with strategic strikes rather than open violence. This form of indirect power was both innovative and highly effective, demonstrating his capacity to blend coercion with business acumen. Even in prostitution, often considered the lowliest and most dangerous of criminal trades, Luciano implemented systems that emphasized control, discretion, and profitability. He recognized the importance of minimizing law enforcement attention while maintaining a steady income stream. By instituting structured operations, managing personnel, schedules, payments, and protection, he turned a chaotic and risky enterprise into a predictable and lucrative part of his portfolio. His approach reflected an understanding that a disciplined, systematic approach to crime could outperform impulsive brutality every time. The psychological dimension of Luciano's criminal business cannot be understated. He cultivated loyalty among subordinates by combining opportunity with oversight, ensuring that rewards were proportional to risk and performance. Fear and respect were used strategically, intimidation secured compliance, while opportunity encouraged initiative and ambition within his organization. This dual approach created a workforce that was both loyal and motivated, capable of executing complex operations without constant direct supervision. Luciano's ability to manage human behavior as carefully as material assets was revolutionary, laying the foundation for a professionalized mafia that could endure internal and external pressures. By turning crime into a structured enterprise, Luciano not only amassed wealth and power but also fundamentally changed the nature of organized crime in America. He demonstrated that illegal operations could be predictable, scalable, and resilient when approached with strategic vision, psychological insight, and meticulous organization. This period of expansion and operational sophistication solidified his reputation as not merely a street-level gangster but as a master businessman of the underworld, capable of orchestrating vast networks with precision, efficiency, and unprecedented foresight. Luciano's rise to power was inseparable from the web of alliances, rivalries, and betrayals that defined the criminal underworld of New York. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, his influence had grown to the point where he could dictate terms not just within his immediate circle, but across entire neighborhoods and criminal networks. Yet with power came enemies. Rival mobsters, threatened by his methods and his consolidation of authority, sought to undermine him through intimidation, sabotage, and even assassination attempts. The underworld was a volatile environment, where alliances could shift overnight, and a miscalculation could be fatal. Luciano navigated this treacherous landscape with a blend of diplomacy, strategy, and calculated force, understanding that survival required not just strength, but intelligence and foresight. The concept of loyalty and betrayal became central to his leadership. Luciano surrounded himself with individuals who were capable, ambitious, and trustworthy, but he also recognized that absolute loyalty was rare and that every associate could potentially become a threat. He cultivated a culture of accountability and mutual benefit, ensuring that allies understood both the rewards of cooperation and the consequences of disloyalty. Betrayals were handled decisively, not merely as acts of vengeance but as strategic lessons for others in the network. By combining fear, respect, and opportunity, Luciano maintained a delicate balance that allowed him to expand his operations while keeping rivals cautious and allies committed. During this period, rivalries among the Italian-American Mafia intensified. The Old Guard, represented by figures such as Salvatore Maranzano, resisted Luciano's modernized vision of organized crime. Maranzano, a traditionalist who valued personal authority and honor over efficiency, viewed Luciano's pragmatic, business-oriented approach as a threat to established hierarchies. This clash of ideologies set the stage for a hidden war within the Mafia, one fought not just with bullets but with strategy, alliances, and intelligence. Luciano, understanding that open conflict could be costly, employed subtle maneuvers to isolate enemies, win over undecided factions, and prepare for decisive action when necessary. Alliances extended beyond Italian-American circles. Luciano cultivated relationships with Jewish and Irish gangsters who controlled significant portions of the city's illicit economy. Figures like Meyer Lansky and Dutch Schultz were instrumental in expanding the reach of his operations, particularly in gambling, bootlegging, and labor racketeering. These cross-ethnic alliances were groundbreaking at the time, challenging the insularity of traditional mafia culture and demonstrating Luciano's willingness to prioritize profit and efficiency over rigid loyalty to ethnicity. The strategic value of these alliances cannot be overstated. They allowed Luciano to consolidate influence, reduce violent conflict, and access new revenue streams that were previously off-limits to an Italian-American faction. The hidden war also involved constant maneuvering around law enforcement and political figures. Luciano recognized that his empire could not thrive without navigating the legal and political landscape skillfully. Bribes, influence, and careful manipulation of officials became as crucial as street-level operations. He ensured that key associates maintained relationships with the right contacts, using these connections to protect shipments, secure favorable outcomes, and neutralize threats from law enforcement or rival gangs. This ability to blend criminal enterprise with political acumen exemplified the dual nature of his power: visible authority on the streets and invisible control behind the scenes. Violence remained a tool, but it was wielded strategically rather than indiscriminately. Assassinations, threats, and intimidation were deployed to shape outcomes, not to vent anger or assert dominance recklessly. Luciano's foresight allowed him to calculate risks, anticipate reactions, and maintain the initiative in conflicts that might have destroyed less disciplined leaders. By controlling both the timing and the perception of force, he created an aura of untouchability that reinforced his authority and discouraged rebellion. This period of alliances, rivalries, and hidden wars solidified Luciano's reputation as a master strategist. He had learned to navigate a world where every relationship carried potential danger, where loyalty was fragile, and where ambition could be lethal. His success lay not just in his ability to wield power, but in his capacity to manage complexity, human, financial, and operational, simultaneously. Through skillful diplomacy, strategic violence, and innovative alliances, Luciano transformed a fragmented, chaotic underworld into a disciplined, coordinated network, laying the groundwork for an empire that would endure for decades. Even the most powerful empires are fragile when the forces of law, betrayal, and circumstance converge, and for Luciano, the beginning of his fall arrived as a stark reminder of that truth. Despite his careful organization, psychological insight, and strategic foresight, he was never invulnerable. By the early 1930s, his empire, though vast and meticulously managed, had attracted the attention of law enforcement agencies, rival gangsters, and political operatives eager to exploit any misstep. The public exposure of criminal networks, fueled by sensationalist media coverage and political pressure to crack down on organized crime, created an environment in which even the most insulated leaders could be targeted. Luciano, who had spent years constructing a system designed for resilience, now faced vulnerabilities that could unravel his carefully woven network. The immediate catalyst for his downfall was his involvement in prostitution and vice operations, which drew the scrutiny of federal authorities. Though he had managed gambling, bootlegging, and union control with relative discretion, the prostitution rings were more visible and politically sensitive, offering law enforcement an opportunity to strike. Investigators, emboldened by public outrage and backed by political mandates, began to focus on high-profile figures in the underworld, including Luciano. They used a combination of surveillance, informants, and sting operations to gather evidence, testing the limits of his operational security. The careful networks he had built were, in some respects, his shield, but they also created points of exposure that could be exploited by determined authorities. Betrayal from within further destabilized his position. Even trusted allies and subordinates could be compromised under pressure, coerced into cooperating with law enforcement or rival factions. The psychological dynamics that had once worked to his advantage, loyalty enforced through opportunity and fear, proved imperfect when confronted with legal threats and moral leverage. Luciano quickly learned that human allegiance was contingent, that his empire was vulnerable not only to external forces but to the shifting loyalties of those closest to him. This dual pressure of law enforcement scrutiny and potential internal betrayal marked the beginning of a precarious descent, testing both his strategic mind and his ability to manipulate outcomes under duress. At the same time, rival mobsters sensed an opening. Figures who had long chafed under Luciano's dominance saw an opportunity to reclaim influence, settle old scores, or expand their own power in the uncertainty surrounding his legal troubles. The underworld, always ruthless and opportunistic, moved quickly, and Luciano faced threats not just from the law but from enemies who were ready to exploit any sign of weakness. His response combined calculated diplomacy and measured intimidation, as he sought to contain both external and internal threats without triggering open warfare that could further destabilize his operations. Psychologically, this period tested Luciano in unprecedented ways. A man accustomed to controlling situations now confronted forces beyond his immediate command. He had to balance risk management with assertive action, navigating a landscape in which missteps could be fatal. His intelligence, intuition, and ruthlessness were all called into play, as he assessed threats, managed alliances, and attempted to shield his organization from the cascading effects of legal and criminal pressures. The tension between his established dominance and newfound vulnerability created an atmosphere of constant vigilance, forcing him to act decisively while remaining strategically prudent. The fall began not as a sudden collapse but as a series of cascading pressures, legal scrutiny tightening around his operations, betrayal creeping through his networks, and rival forces probing for weaknesses. Each challenge required attention, strategy, and manipulation, but the cumulative weight of these pressures signaled that even a mastermind like Luciano was not impervious. It was a delicate dance between survival and capitulation, requiring every ounce of cunning and foresight that had brought him to the pinnacle of power. In retrospect, the beginning of Luciano's downfall underscores a fundamental truth about power: it is always contingent, fragile, and vulnerable to forces beyond control. Even the most meticulously organized empire can be destabilized by the convergence of law, human frailty, and ambition. For Luciano, this period marked the end of invincibility, the first cracks in a carefully constructed facade, and the prelude to the public and legal battles that would define the next stage of his life. The Fall Begins is not merely a story of arrest and prosecution, it is a study in the psychological and operational vulnerabilities that even the most brilliant leaders must navigate when the world pushes back against their dominance. The trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle that gripped New York City and captured the attention of the entire nation. By the time Luciano faced the courtroom, he had already amassed a reputation as one of the most powerful and feared figures in the underworld, and the authorities were determined to make an example of him. The case centered on charges of compulsory prostitution, a politically charged and morally fraught issue that allowed prosecutors to frame him not only as a criminal but as a corrupter of society. The courtroom became a stage where the forces of law, public opinion, and the criminal underworld collided, with Luciano at the center, navigating each with calculated precision. The media played a crucial role in shaping public perception. Newspapers sensationalized the trial, painting Luciano as both a monster and a fascinating anti-hero. Headlines depicted him as the mastermind of vice and corruption, emphasizing lurid details of prostitution rings and criminal conspiracies. Public fascination with his personal life, his charisma, charm, and reputation for ruthlessness, added to the drama, turning the legal proceedings into a narrative almost as cinematic as the real-life power struggles of the Mafia. The coverage heightened the stakes for all involved, making every statement, every witness, and every strategic maneuver in court an event of national significance. Luciano's legal defense was meticulous, reflecting the same strategic mind that had guided his criminal operations. He sought to challenge the credibility of witnesses, highlight procedural flaws, and undermine the prosecution's narrative without appearing evasive or dismissive. At the same time, he had to navigate the psychological dimension of the trial, projecting calm, intelligence, and authority even under the intense scrutiny of judges, juries, and the press. Every gesture, tone, and word was measured to reinforce his image as a man who, despite his criminal label, remained in control of both himself and the narrative surrounding him. The courtroom drama also revealed the moral complexities of Luciano's empire. Prosecutors emphasized the social harm caused by his operations, particularly the exploitation of women in prostitution rings. Luciano's defense, while denying direct involvement in coercion, had to contend with a reality in which his leadership and organizational structures had enabled and profited from these activities. This tension between direct responsibility and systemic control highlighted the broader ethical ambiguities inherent in organized crime. Luciano had built an empire that operated efficiently and lucratively, but the human cost of its operations could not be entirely obscured, even by strategic brilliance. Behind the public spectacle, the trial involved intense maneuvering among law enforcement, political figures, and rival gangsters. Some in the underworld viewed the trial as an opportunity to weaken Luciano's influence, while others sought to ensure their own survival by cooperating with authorities. Law enforcement, meanwhile, was under pressure to secure a conviction that would demonstrate both moral authority and effectiveness in combating organized crime. The courtroom became a battlefield of perception, strategy, and influence, with every move carrying consequences for Luciano's personal freedom, his organization, and the broader balance of power in the criminal underworld. Ultimately, the trial culminated in a conviction that carried both symbolic and practical weight. Luciano's sentencing demonstrated that no amount of intelligence, organization, or psychological manipulation could render one entirely immune to the forces of law and politics. Yet even in defeat, he retained a remarkable degree of influence, both through his established networks and through the calculated relationships he had nurtured within the legal and political system. His ability to anticipate, negotiate, and adapt remained evident, even as the consequences of legal action closed in. The trial and the sentence represented a pivotal turning point, not just in Luciano's life but in the evolution of organized crime. It exposed the vulnerabilities of even the most meticulously managed empire, highlighted the intersection of public morality and legal authority, and demonstrated the power of perception in shaping outcomes. For Luciano, it was a lesson in resilience, strategy, and the limits of control, a reminder that even a master architect of power must contend with forces beyond his direct influence, and that the interplay of law, media, and human ambition can alter the course of history in ways both dramatic and irreversible. Even behind bars, Lucky Luciano's influence did not wane. If anything, his imprisonment became another arena in which his strategic genius and psychological acuity were on full display. Prison, for most men, is a place of confinement, limitation, and vulnerability, but for Luciano, it was an opportunity to continue exercising control, to consolidate networks, and to maintain operational oversight of the criminal empire he had built. He understood that power did not reside solely in physical presence, it existed in relationships, perception, and the ability to manipulate systems, even from within the walls of a penitentiary. While many mobsters lost authority once incarcerated, Luciano's intellect allowed him to operate as though the prison itself were another node in his network, a place from which influence could be projected outward. One of the most remarkable aspects of Luciano's control from prison was his continued management of operations through trusted intermediaries. He had meticulously built a hierarchy in which key lieutenants, enforcers, and financial managers could execute his directives with minimal oversight. Regular communication through coded messages, trusted visitors, and carefully orchestrated meetings ensured that profits continued to flow and that his authority remained unchallenged. Luciano's understanding of human behavior was critical in this context. He had cultivated loyalty, instilled fear, and reinforced respect in ways that allowed his subordinates to act independently while remaining aligned with his strategic vision. His presence was felt even when absent, a testament to the psychological infrastructure he had created. Beyond operational control, Luciano used his time in prison to reinforce alliances and negotiate long-term stability for his organization. He understood that survival depended on maintaining cohesion within the Mafia, preventing fragmentation, and mitigating the risks of internal betrayal. By carefully balancing incentives and punishments, he ensured that key figures remained loyal and compliant, even under the pressure of law enforcement scrutiny. Luciano's skill lay in his ability to project authority without direct confrontation, using reputation, strategy, and selective displays of power to maintain his position as the ultimate arbiter of influence. Prison also offered Luciano a unique perspective on the intersection of power, law, and politics. He observed the mechanisms by which authorities sought to control organized crime, noting both their strengths and their vulnerabilities. These insights later informed his approach to negotiation with political figures and law enforcement, including arrangements that would eventually secure his release and exile. Luciano's ability to learn and adapt even in confinement exemplified his lifelong strategy. The mind, rather than brute force, was the ultimate tool for control and survival. Psychologically, maintaining influence from prison required constant attention to perception. Luciano cultivated an image of authority and composure, demonstrating to both allies and adversaries that incarceration did not diminish his power. Stories of his continued oversight, strategic decisions, and unyielding control reinforced his untouchable reputation, dissuading rivals from attempting to seize his territories or challenge his leadership. Even in confinement, he remained a figure whose decisions carried weight and whose presence shaped the dynamics of the criminal underworld. The period of power behind bars also illustrates a critical lesson in resilience and adaptability. Luciano transformed what could have been a period of vulnerability into one of strategic consolidation, demonstrating that true leadership extends beyond physical presence. He managed to protect his empire, maintain loyalty, and even influence the evolution of organized crime from within prison walls. This ability to operate effectively under constraint highlighted the sophistication of his vision and the depth of his understanding of human behavior, organization, and perception. In essence, Luciano's prison years were not a retreat but a continuation of his mastery over the criminal landscape. By leveraging relationships, reinforcing loyalty, projecting authority, and exploiting opportunities even in confinement, he ensured that his influence remained intact. Power, he demonstrated, was not simply about territory or muscle, it was about strategy, perception, and the ability to orchestrate complex networks regardless of circumstance. This period solidified his legacy as not merely a violent gangster but as a strategist capable of commanding an empire from anywhere, even behind the iron bars of a New York penitentiary. After years of incarceration, Lucky Luciano's story took yet another dramatic turn with his deportation to Italy, a move that symbolized both the end of one chapter and the beginning of a new, more complex phase of his life. For a man who had built his empire on the streets of New York, exile could have meant obscurity and loss of influence. Yet Luciano approached this forced displacement with the same strategic foresight and adaptability that had characterized his rise. He understood that even in exile, he could leverage his experience, contacts, and intellect to maintain relevance, protect his interests, and, paradoxically, shape the future of organized crime from afar. The journey to Sicily was psychologically jarring. Luciano returned to the land of his birth, yet it was no longer the home of his youth. Italy had changed politically, socially, and economically, and the Sicilian Mafia had evolved in his absence. He was simultaneously an insider by heritage and an outsider by experience, carrying the weight of his American successes while navigating old-world traditions. In this environment, Luciano relied on his acute understanding of human behavior to establish his position. He carefully assessed local dynamics, identified potential allies, and evaluated threats, recognizing that influence abroad required both subtlety and patience. During his years in exile, Luciano maintained clandestine communication with his American network, ensuring that his interests were safeguarded even from a distance. Trusted lieutenants and intermediaries became essential conduits for information, strategy, and enforcement. Luciano's experience in organizational management and psychological manipulation allowed him to maintain authority without direct supervision, demonstrating once again that power was as much about perception and relationships as it was about physical presence. Even in exile, he remained a figure whose decisions could reverberate across the Atlantic, influencing the operations and alliances of his former empire. At the same time, Luciano's exile prompted reflection and transformation. Removed from the immediate pressures of street-level power struggles, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions, the fragility of loyalty, and the limits of control. This period revealed the human costs of his empire, not only the suffering imposed on others but the personal isolation and vulnerability inherent in a life defined by risk and betrayal. It also offered an opportunity for strategic recalibration, to consider new avenues of influence, to reassess alliances, and to plan for a future in which his legacy could endure despite physical separation from the streets he once dominated. Luciano's time in Italy also intersected with larger historical forces. World War II reshaped the global landscape, and Luciano's unique position and connections allowed him to influence events beyond traditional criminal activity. He cooperated with American intelligence agencies, providing guidance and support for operations in Sicily, leveraging his knowledge of local networks, geography, and politics. This collaboration reflected both pragmatism and opportunism. Luciano recognized that even as a deportee, he could exert strategic influence in ways that served both personal and broader objectives. His role during this period demonstrated a remarkable adaptability, transforming exile from a limitation into a platform for continued relevance and negotiation. Exile, in essence, became a test of Luciano's enduring strategic and psychological skills. He had to maintain authority without proximity, manage relationships across distance and language, and navigate unfamiliar political and social terrain. This required an unprecedented level of patience, subtlety, and foresight. The exile period highlighted a new dimension of his leadership, the capacity to influence, negotiate, and survive under conditions where direct action was impossible. It underscored the enduring power of perception, reputation, and strategic thinking, showing that Luciano's genius lay not merely in violence or intimidation but in his ability to orchestrate complex systems of influence under any circumstances. Ultimately, the exile and endgame phase of Luciano's life represents both a personal and strategic evolution. He transitioned from the commanding presence of a street and empire-based leader to a more subtle, globally aware figure, capable of shaping outcomes through intelligence, alliances, and foresight. His deportation did not erase his legacy, instead, it tested the durability of his strategies and the strength of the networks he had created. Even removed from New York, Luciano's mind and influence remained formidable, leaving a lasting imprint on the structure, operations, and psychology of organized crime that would endure long after his final days. Lucky Luciano's legacy is monumental, not merely for the wealth he accumulated or the violence he orchestrated, but for the profound transformation he imposed on organized crime itself. He did not invent the Mafia, but he reinvented it, taking a fragmented, chaotic underworld and molding it into a disciplined, corporate-like enterprise. His innovations, centralized authority through the commission, systematic management of operations, strategic alliances across ethnic lines, and the judicious use of fear and loyalty, created a model that would endure for decades. Luciano demonstrated that criminal activity, when approached with intellect, organization, and psychological insight, could be both profitable and sustainable, setting a standard that modern organized crime continues to emulate. One of the most striking aspects of Luciano's legacy is his impact on the structure of power within the Mafia. Prior to his intervention, New York's criminal landscape was fragmented, dominated by rival factions engaged in constant violent struggle. Luciano introduced a system of governance that reduced internecine warfare and established protocols for dispute resolution, territory allocation, and succession planning. By creating the commission, he effectively institutionalized authority, allowing the Mafia to operate with coordination, predictability, and strategic foresight. This organizational blueprint enabled the Mafia not only to survive law enforcement pressures but also to expand into new territories and industries, a feat that had been impossible under the old system of disjointed fiefdoms. Beyond structural reforms, Luciano's psychological mastery set him apart as a leader. He understood that fear and respect were not merely tools of enforcement but instruments of influence. He leveraged both to ensure loyalty, motivate subordinates, and deter rivals, creating an environment in which compliance was earned and rebellion carried significant risk. At the same time, he recognized the power of opportunity and reward, using incentives to bind allies to his vision. This sophisticated understanding of human behavior allowed him to maintain control over complex operations without needing to micromanage every aspect, highlighting his brilliance as both a strategist and a manipulator of perception. Luciano's influence also extended beyond the borders of New York and the United States. Through partnerships with Jewish, Irish, and other criminal figures, he demonstrated the benefits of cross-cultural collaboration in organized crime. These alliances not only increased efficiency and profitability but also laid the groundwork for the globalization of organized crime in the decades to come. His approach emphasized pragmatism over prejudice, results over tradition, and innovation over brute force, a philosophy that fundamentally altered the way criminal networks operated. Yet, Luciano's legacy is not without moral ambiguity. While he is celebrated for his strategic brilliance and organizational genius, the empire he created was built on exploitation, coercion, and violence. Countless individuals suffered under the systems he established, from women trapped in prostitution to rivals eliminated through calculated assassinations. The duality of his legacy, genius and ruthlessness, innovation and immorality, captures the complexity of his character and the paradox of his enduring influence. He is remembered as both a visionary and a villain, a man whose intellect reshaped the underworld while leaving an indelible mark of human cost. Finally, Luciano's impact is evident in the very way modern organized crime is studied and understood. His methods transformed the Mafia from a series of disorganized street gangs into a sophisticated enterprise capable of long-term planning, diversification, and resilience. Law enforcement agencies, criminologists, and historians often cite his strategies as foundational to the evolution of organized crime, emphasizing the enduring relevance of his innovations. His life serves as a case study in leadership, strategy, and the psychology of power, illustrating both the possibilities and the perils inherent in the pursuit of dominance. In sum, the legacy of a Don is a story of transformation, strategy, and paradox. Luciano reshaped the Mafia into a disciplined, efficient, and far-reaching organization, demonstrating the power of intellect, organization, and psychological mastery. Yet his success came at enormous moral and human cost, a reminder that genius in the criminal world is inseparable from brutality and exploitation. His influence endures not only in the operations of contemporary organized crime but also in the cultural imagination, where he remains a symbol of ambition, cunning, and the complex interplay between power, loyalty, and morality. Luciano's story comes full circle when we consider the tension between myth and reality, between the legend of the untouchable Don and the man behind the empire. By the time of his death, he had become both a symbol of organized crime sophistication and a cautionary tale about the cost of power. His life encapsulated the extremes of human ambition, extraordinary intellect and strategic genius on one hand, ruthlessness and moral compromise on the other. Audiences today are drawn to Luciano not simply because he was a gangster, but because he exemplifies the complex interplay between charisma, intelligence, and the darker impulses that drive human behavior. He achieved unparalleled dominance in a world defined by violence and treachery, yet that dominance was constantly contingent, maintained through a combination of foresight, manipulation, and psychological insight. The legend of Lucky Luciano is in many ways inseparable from the cultural imagination of the Mafia. Films, books, and documentaries have elevated him to a near-mythical status, emphasizing his strategic brilliance, his role as the architect of the commission, and his ability to run a criminal empire with the efficiency of a corporate executive. This mythologized version of Luciano often downplays the violence, exploitation, and human suffering that underpinned his success. It presents a narrative of ingenuity and power, sometimes romanticizing the ruthless decisions necessary to achieve dominance. Yet the reality of his life, his arrests, betrayals, exile, and the ever-present threat of death, reveals the precariousness inherent in even the most meticulously constructed criminal empire. At the same time, Luciano's story offers enduring lessons about human psychology, leadership, and strategy. He demonstrated the power of perception, the importance of relationships, and the necessity of balancing fear with opportunity. His genius lay not merely in his ability to intimidate or command, but in his capacity to orchestrate complex networks of people and operations, maintaining control even in the most adverse circumstances. He understood that influence extends beyond immediate physical presence, it resides in the systems one builds, the alliances one cultivates, and the reputation one projects. These lessons extend beyond the criminal world, offering insight into the universal dynamics of power, loyalty, and human behavior. The conclusion of Luciano's life also highlights the inevitability of consequence. Despite his brilliance, he could not entirely escape the forces of law, exile, or mortality. His empire endured beyond him, but his personal freedom and authority were constrained by circumstances he could not fully control. This duality, the simultaneous triumph of intellect and inevitability of human limitation, adds a layer of poignancy to his story. It is a reminder that power, no matter how skillfully managed, is always subject to external pressures, shifting loyalties, and the unpredictable currents of history. Ultimately, the story of Lucky Luciano is more than a tale of crime and ambition, it is a meditation on the human condition. It explores the interplay of genius and ruthlessness, the fragility of power, and the moral ambiguities inherent in the pursuit of dominance. His life challenges us to consider the cost of success, the limits of control, and the ways in which intelligence and psychology can shape both personal destiny and larger historical forces. Luciano's legacy, a mixture of innovation, terror, and strategic brilliance, endures as a testament to the complex, often contradictory nature of leadership in a world governed by both human ambition and human frailty. In the end, the man behind the myth is both extraordinary and deeply human. He was a strategist, a manipulator, a visionary, and a criminal, someone whose life illuminates the interplay between power and vulnerability, loyalty and betrayal, morality and ambition. The conclusion of his story leaves us with a complex portrait, a man whose influence reshaped organized crime forever, yet whose life also serves as a reminder of the limits of control, the inevitability of consequence, and the enduring tension between legend and reality.